Has this ever happened to you when playing an open world game? At first, you're enamored by the world, stumbling around the first few areas in the start of the game and having a great time just getting immersed in everything. Every interesting thing you see, you get to explore and experience. But then, right as the game has shown you what it's all about, and you're hyped to keep going and explore even more, something changes. All of a sudden, you start feeling burnt out and the game just stops being interesting, and the source of motivation for playing it changes from genuinely wanting to explore the world to just wanting to get it over with and move on to the next thing. And it stays that way until you finally either finish it or drop it to return to it someday, which we all know means that you're just lying to yourself and never actually playing it again. If any of this sounds familiar to you, you're not alone. I've had this happen with almost every open world game that I've played in recent times. And I think that all of this is because of one pretty simple design choice. Open world games are just too damn big. Please let me preface this by saying that I'm not anti-open world or anything. I love the idea of having a non-linear game with a huge open map filled with interesting places to go and stories to discover. And to me, this is the point of open world in the first place. Instead of forcing you to follow a set path, it encourages you to carve your own, to follow your gut feeling and be rewarded for your curiosity. But while exploration can in itself be fun, and it usually is in games like this, it's not enough on its own. Exploration always has the expectation of discovery, and it can feel underwhelming if it doesn't result in anything new or interesting. Many open world games just fail to make that part of the game consistently rewarding enough to keep me interested in the world for the 100+ hours it takes to beat one of these games. And it's not just a problem with those often criticized Ubisoft-style open worlds. The open world genre already has a lot of problems, from anti-exploration game design choices like map markers and waypoints to handholdy to-do list style gameplay. But even the critically acclaimed games that people love to say have quote-unquote fixed open world run into the exact same issue of size. Even the good ones are way too big for their own good. Open world as a genre is surprisingly vague in its definition. Everyone knows what it looks like. You have the map, the fast travel, and there are not many hard restrictions in regards to where you can and can't go. But when you actually try to narrow it down to an exact definition, it's not that easy. In Wikipedia, it's defined as a level or game designed as non-linear open areas with many ways to reach an objective. But if we look at something like Dark Souls 1, which people don't usually think of as open world, according to most definitions, it kind of is. It's definitely non-linear, and while its world is not field-shaped, but instead like a labyrinth of connecting branches, most of the game is contained within one mostly open, interconnected area. You could make the argument that Dark Souls is more like a 3D Metroidvania, as you do need to find items and beat enemies to unlock some areas in the game, but the same is true for most recognized open-world games as well. There are multiple areas locked behind items and quests in Elden Ring, and you're stuck on the first level for a couple of hours in Breath of the Wild before the game really opens up, but I don't think anyone seriously denies that those games are open world. Because of the fluidity of the term, it might be easier to think about open world as less of a genre and more like an attribute of openness on a sliding scale that you can have more or less of, with something like Dark Souls being on the lower side and Breath of the Wild being on the higher side of openness. And it's not every game with this attribute that runs into the issue of being too big, but rather it seems to be way more prevalent in the games higher up on the openness scale. Which makes a ton of sense. When you look at how much actual space there is in Dark Souls 1 compared to something vast and open field-like Elden Ring, it's considerably small in comparison, which would allow the developer to spend more time perfecting every part of the world instead of being occupied with making sure that every corner of the world is at least filled with something so that it doesn't feel as empty. I'm sorry for misleading you with the title of the video, but the size is not actually the primary issue here, but rather what causes the issue, which is repetitive content used in an inappropriate way. It's like there's a disconnect between what this kind of map design encourages you to do and what the end result of doing that is. When I'm playing a game that has a cool, massive world filled with interesting looking places and things to do, I want to explore every nook and cranny to find what the game has to offer. But when the result of that exploration, the thing that I find at the end of it, feels like something that I've already found a handful of times in the game before, it's almost like that exploration didn't amount to anything. I didn't learn or do anything new. And when I reach the point in my playthrough when that starts happening more often than it doesn't, I feel like I would have more fun if I just played through the main story while ignoring everything around me. But if I were to do that, I would be ignoring the main point of open world to begin with. After somewhat recently having played these two games, which, don't get me wrong, are both great games that do a lot of things right, it's apparent that even a large developer like Nintendo, or someone like From Software who doesn't seem capable of missing, don't have what it takes to create enough unique content to actually match the size of a map like this. And as a result, by leaning so heavily into the openness of the world, are simultaneously choosing quantity over quality in a lot of the content a game this open and big necessitates. The smaller things scattered around the world that you get to engage with when you're not furthering the main quest. I'm going to use Elden Ring as a key example in this video, and the reason for that is because I feel like a lot of people see that game as like a shining example of how an open world game should be. If I talked about something like Assassin's Creed here instead, it would be easy to just say that it has problems because Ubisoft sucks and not because of the inherent problems in the current way open world games are designed. So I feel like it's just more productive to explain how this problem appears in Elden Ring due to how people view it as one of those exceptions to the rule that have fixed the genre. And if you're a massive Elden Ring fan, please allow me to show you what I mean before you lose your shit. I'm a huge Soulsborne fan, so just having a larger scale world in that style was pretty cool to experience, at least for some amount of time. And I even ended up beating it 4 times in total. On the first playthrough, I went slow and explored and did every piece of content that I could find, and on the other 3, I just did the other things I didn't manage to do on the first one. And it was during that first exploration heavy playthrough where I mainly ran into this problem. I would categorize the content that you find while exploring the game into 4 different categories, which are 1. Genuinely incredible and unique content like quests and legacy dungeons, 2. Unproblematic repeating features / content that are to be expected in any game like this, like non-quest NPCs, regular enemies, checkpoints, etc. 3. Dungeons, and 4. Overworld bosses that are either just walking around or in Everjails. And it's in those last 2 categories where the game runs out of steam pretty quickly. All of the dungeons are fairly similar to each other. You have a series of rooms with normal enemies that eventually lead you to the boss room, and sometimes there's a simple lever puzzle involved. And the overworld bosses are pretty self-explanatory. You fight them in the overworld, and then you fight them. Because all of the enemies and dungeons were still new to me, I genuinely enjoyed exploring every part of the first 2-ish areas. But it was right after that where it slowly started feeling more and more tedious the more time I spent with the game. And after looking at the numbers, I don't think it's surprising why I felt this way. All of the 53 dungeons in Elden Ring, in terms of style and what enemies you can find there, basically fit into 3 categories: catacombs, caves, and tunnels. Every dungeon of the same type looks roughly the same and usually has the same enemies that you can find in them. And this sometimes makes them feel pretty out of place, as regardless if you're exploring the lush green nature of Limgrave or the corrupt hellscape of Caelid, what lies beneath the surface can make you feel like you haven't moved anywhere. But while this causes the dungeons to feel detached from the actual world, which, don't get me wrong, isn't ideal, the most egregious issue to me were the bosses at the ends of those dungeons, along with the bosses in the overworld. What makes a boss fight in a game like this fun, and also sometimes very frustrating for me in the first place, is the process of solving the fight through trial and error. You keep trying again and again, slowly learning the moveset, while finding small gaps where you get to do a bit of damage, and eventually you figure it out and are able to edge out the win. It's challenging, fun, and the kind of experience that FromSoft is well known for. One Redditor went through the trouble of calculating just how many repeating bosses Elden Ring has and found that there are 169 repeated encounters in total, not counting the regular enemies that show up as boss encounters in the beginning of the game. That means that in 169 of the fights where the health bar shows up on your screen and the music starts playing, you're fighting a boss that you've already solved before, which is an insane number when compared to FromSoft's less open games, like Dark Souls 1 for example, where there are 3 variations of the Asylum Demon, resulting in 2 repeated boss encounters, the only 2 in the entire game. The problem with this is that once you know how to beat the boss, beating the same boss again isn't as interesting anymore. You just do the same thing again that you learned to do before, and that's it. And if you decide to explore everything in the game, have fun, you get to do that 169 times in total. There's this moment in the game where during one of the optional quests, you make your way deep underground through an ominous dead city illuminated by a fake sky above it. You find an elevator that takes you even deeper, and you come upon this massive, dangerous, rotting lake that you have to cross to go further. The more you follow the rot, the stranger and more corrupted your surroundings become, and then, finally at the point to where all of the rotting sludge is flowing towards, on the edge of a cliff, you find an empty coffin that you're given the option to get inside of. And when you make the very rational decision of doing just that, the rotting waterfall takes you all the way down, and at this impossibly deep, surreal location, you find something that you've never seen before in the game. A giant alien creature not from this world, with control over gravity and the ability to use space magic to fight you. The boss fight with Astel, Natural Born of the Void, is cool as hell all the way from the steps it takes you to get there to how alien everything about the fight feels. It's also the point where the vibe of the game changes a bit as Elden Ring starts to shift from a typical medieval fantasy towards cosmic horror. You find Astel close to the end of a very convoluted and long quest line, which is easy to miss if you aren't looking things up while playing the game. Hiding great content like this in an open world game is pretty damn bold, and at the same time exactly what open world is about. You commit to the exploration and are rewarded with something impactful and memorable. Which is why it feels so jarring when in one of the endgame areas you find another Astel just chilling inside of a regular ass cave, retroactively making the initial fight feel less special, and the new Astel fight feel like you were playing the game with a boss fight randomizer mod or something. A similar thing happens with the first main boss in the game, Godric the Grafted, where later you fight a boss called Godfroy the Grafted, aka totally not Godric, who in the lore is a different person, but also has the same model and the same moveset as Godric does. And while it's true that the first encounters with the bosses are some of the best content FromSoft has to offer, the amount of repetition in this game not only makes the boss fights mechanically monotonous, but also makes the world less convincing, and as a consequence, the atmosphere these games are so well known for just doesn't hit the same. I just recently replayed Bloodborne, and during my playthrough I was constantly blown away by how purposeful and immersive its world feels in comparison, despite it being released 7 years earlier. Every part of that game, from its world, NPCs and enemies, feels meticulously crafted to evoke that feeling of bleak, impending doom and the fear of unknown. And it succeeds in that without making the game too big to the point where rehashing any old content would be necessary. Meanwhile in Elden Ring, fighting a second Astel in a cave somewhere didn't feel meticulously crafted to evoke anything at all other than confusion, and not in a good way. You might argue that, well, Bloodborne is a tiny game in comparison, and of course there's going to be some amount of repetition in a bigger game. But in that case, what is even the point of making the game so big that its size ends up hurting itself? In a 2019 interview about Elden Ring, Miyazaki, the father of Souls-like, gave 3 reasons as to why he wanted to make the game the way that it is. First, he wanted to show the game's world and lore on a grander scale, which I do think he managed to do pretty well, but it also backfired in some ways. Secondly, he wanted to create more variation in battles, which kind of ended up happening as there are a lot of unique enemies and you can also fight from horseback in addition to fighting normally. And finally, he wanted to add more freedom and depth to exploration. While you can't deny the freedom that this type of design gives the player, when it comes to depth, it just doesn't deliver. That jaw-dropping feeling of realizing just how massive the map is when you've only scratched its surface is nice, but when you attempt to dig a bit below the surface, that feeling of awe quickly goes away when you realize how little depth there actually is to most of it. I talk about it in length in my video about the game, and I'm not going to repeat myself too much here, but as I said before, it's not only an Elden Ring problem, and Elden Ring is actually far from being the worst offender when it comes to this. Tears of the Kingdom, another recent critically praised open world game, suffers from this as well, even at a much more extreme level. Everything from the bosses, enemies, main quests and caves repeat with minimal variation over and over again throughout the entirety of the game, and it took until about the halfway point of the game for me to get tired of it. But after seeing the reception these games have gotten, this clearly doesn't seem to be a problem for a lot of fans. And I've actually read people defending this type of game design on the internet before, stating that the repetition is not actually an issue, as it can be used effectively as a gameplay mechanic, and people also do enjoy replaying games that they've played before, so why should this be any different? And I think that both of those points are actually kind of true. I love replaying games. I just replayed Bloodborne and had no problem with it, but there is a huge difference in making the conscious choice of playing a game again after some amount of time having passed and being bamboozled into replaying content before you've even had the chance to finish your first playthrough. It's also true that not all repetition is bad. Some amount of it is of course unavoidable, like the core mechanics the game is built around, and there are legitimately good and fun ways to use repetition as a gameplay mechanic. Roguelikes are extremely repetitive. You fight the same enemies and bosses over and over again, but I still love playing them. Competitive games are also very repetitive, and I don't have a problem with those either. What makes these cases and open world games feel so different is the intent behind that repetition. Roguelikes are intended to be repetitive, so that in each and every run you're able to learn how to build your character in a way that allows you to progress further, which then allows you to eventually reach new content. And the entire purpose of a competitive game is to give you this one specific repetitive challenge, and you improving your strategy and mechanics, becoming a better player, is what makes playing it worthwhile. But when it comes to open world, at least from my point of view, the purpose of having a big open game is giving the player countless possibilities for exploration and different paths that they could take, which is exactly where the repetition becomes a flaw. When the thing that awaits at the ends of those possibilities is a boss or a dungeon that you feel like you've already seen 20 times at that point, the exploration, the entire purpose of the world being big and open, ceases to be meaningful. So to reiterate my point, my problem isn't the size of the world or even the repetition, but rather the contradiction between what the world design encourages you to do and what is the outcome of doing that. I feel like by prioritizing size over all, the quantity of places to go over the quality, a lot of developers fail to use open world as a feature effectively. And by making this decision, a level of focus and detail is lost in return for a longer playtime and a feeling of, wow, this game is so big. And at least for me, the end result is rarely worth it. The whole popularity of the genre is weird to me. I just don't get the appeal of this kind of design where the actual content is divided into these dense clusters scattered around the map with a bunch of redundant fluff in between. But when looking at the sales numbers, I realized that I might totally be in the minority with this opinion. With the success of Elden Ring, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom absolutely towering over the rest of the games in their respective series, it's clear that it's working and a lot of people want this instead of these. And I know that I might have come off nitpicky in this video, but I don't hate these games. I had a blast with Elden Ring. It has some of the best fights and moments in the series, and I like Tears of the Kingdom as well. I just think they and other games of this style would be more fun if there was less repetition in them. But that's about everything I wanted to say. I'm really interested in hearing your opinion about this. Do you think open world games are in a good place in their current state, or would you want to see something done differently? Please let me know in the comments. And thank you so much for watching. If you like the video, please leave a like. I try to post videos like this around once a month, so if you want to see more stuff like this, please subscribe to my channel. And yeah, that's about it. Thanks again. Bye.